A few months ago, I made a video in which I compared the phonetic readings of hanja and kanji, specifically focusing on the transfer from Korean to Japanese. I said I would make another video where I would do it the other way around, and this is it. I'm not going to get into the minutiae of my methodology, as I would just be repeating what I said in that video, so if you're curious, please watch it first, but I will give you a general overview of how I went about this little study. I used a sample of about 2,000 common kanji and wrote down their Sino-Korean and Sino-Japanese readings, and then compared them, trying to find patterns that would aid in transferring from one language to the other. A character reading can be divided into the initial, which is the initial consonant, and its final, which is the vowel or diphthong that follows, with an optional coda. Just like in the original video, I will be analyzing these constituent elements separately. At the end of the video, I said that I expected the transfer from Japanese to Korean to be much more problematic than the other way around, and surprise surprise, I was right. But let me back that up with numbers. First and foremost, Korean has more possible readings, 424 versus the Japanese 286. This means that if we take a Japanese reading and try to find a Korean equivalent, we have more possibilities to choose from than the other way around. If we take the total number of correspondences between the two languages and divide it by the number of unique readings in either of them, we get the average number of readings in one language per reading in the other language. This means that, on average, while one Korean reading corresponds to a little over 2 Japanese readings, an average Japanese reading has over 3 Korean equivalents. We can analyze this further. For each initial and final in either language, I looked at what it corresponds to in the other language. Usually there's more than one option, but one stands out as the most likely one. Let's call it the major reading. By dividing the number of characters across all major readings by the total number of characters, we can essentially figure out the likelihood that if you pick the most common equivalent for a given reading, you'll be correct. And as you can see, this figure hovers around 75% if we try to guess Japanese readings based on Korean ones, but the other way around is only about 60%. You can see it on this graph, where green signifies 100% likelihood that the major reading will be correct, and red signifies 0%. As you can see, it's greener for the Korean to Japanese transfer. I will test these numbers on real words at the end of the video. Okay, let's start our analysis with codas. The first issue is, what do we even define as a coda in a Sino-Japanese reading? Well, in Korean it's pretty clear. Japanese technically only has one true coda, a nasal one. It's typically transcribed as N, but its pronunciation depends on what comes after it. Japanese, just like Mandarin, has merged coda M and N, but this is not the case in Korean. As such, this Japanese coda corresponds to either Nyeon or Myeom in Korean, though Nyeon is about 4 times as common as Myeom. There are 2 characters which break this rule, and this will happen in some instances. This usually comes from corrupted or alternate readings that became standardized, though the character bin is an example of a regular process of transcribing the Chinese velar nasal coda as n in borrowings from the 10th century onwards. It's not common, but it happens. Outside of the nasal coda, Japanese syllables cannot end in a consonant, so in other cases we have to insert a vowel. Readings ending in ku or ki correspond to Korean kiok. This is the inverse of the nasal coda, where one Japanese coda corresponded to 2 in Korean. In this case, 2 Japanese codas correspond to 1 Korean coda, which makes things easier. I found 2 outliers where the coda disappears in Korean. Readings that include the coda exist too, but are rare or obsolete. Similarly, Japanese tsu and chi generally correspond to Korean ryul, ultimately originating from Middle Chinese t coda. However, we also have some instances where tsu corresponds to piup. This is because Chinese coda p was sometimes analyzed as a doubling of the following consonant in Japanese, which was how coda t was generally treated, so in some cases they merged. If you can think of a kanji that has 2 readings, one ending with tsu and one with u, it almost certainly corresponds to coda piup in Korean. I also found one character where a kanji ending in tsu has no coda in Korean. Things get a little more complicated when we look at the remaining codas. In Korean, we're left with iung and piup, which in Japanese were generally lost and surface as long vowels. There's only a few of these, so we might as well take a look at them. E becomes iung in Korean about 60% of the time, and otherwise corresponds to vowels. This is similar for o and yo, as well as u and u, though in the latter case the proportions are reversed. These 4 are also the only vowel finals which can correspond to Korean coda piup. Finally, it's possible for and u to become ing in Korean, but it's very rare. I'll give you a few examples for all coda equivalences before we move on. We can now move on to initials. Starting with nasals, m is the most straightforward as it corresponds to mium 100% of the time. N is a little more interesting. You would think it would correspond to nian, but those readings are actually in the minority. Surprisingly, the most common Korean consonant here is ing. This is due to the Middle Chinese initial ny preserving its nasality in Japanese but losing it in Korean. The ing readings almost always come from Japanese palatalized n, though note that because e cannot be a palatalizer in Japanese, we just get ne here. The opposite is not necessarily true though. Palatalized n can correspond to nian, but ing is still more common. If we treat n and nya as two separate initials, the predictability of Korean equivalents improves drastically, though ni and ne belonging to both sets makes things a little harder. Then there are two Japanese initials which I merged into one, since both plain and iotated vowels in Korean make use of the ing initial. I found 5 outliers, 3 corresponding to hiet and 2 to kiok. Now let's look at plosives, starting with h, which isn't a plosive, but it used to be, and that's why it most commonly corresponds to piup in Korean, or more rarely its aspirated equivalent piup. For b, the most common Korean equivalent is actually mium, and we'll see that all Japanese voiced stops can surface as their homorganic nasal counterparts in Korean. Otherwise, b corresponds to either of the two labial plosives we saw with the previous initial. Coronal stops are the least predictable by far. T is split almost evenly between 4 Korean consonants, tiet, tiget, tiet, and tiet. I also found 2 characters where it corresponds to nian. D is pretty similar, though the major reading is tiget, followed by tiet, tiet, and nian. Moving on to the velars, k most often comes up as kiap, less commonly as hiet. There are also a few characters where it becomes ing, and we also have one with kiet. This is a very rare initial in Korean, so chances are you won't encounter it outside of this one character. Finally, g's primarily equivalent is ing. This correspondence may seem strange, but once again I can explain it with historical sound developments. These readings originate from the Middle Chinese velar nasal initial, which lost its nasality in Korean and fortified into a plosive in Japanese. Other than that, g can surface as either hiet or kiap, as was the case for k. Moving on, we have s, which can correspond to any of the sibilants found in Korean, most commonly siot, followed by tsiet, and then tsiet. There are also 2 characters which come up as the tense counterpart of siot, and this initial is another one of the really rare ones that you won't see outside of a handful of characters. Voiced z has similar equivalents, though with the addition of ing. This unusual correspondence once again stems from Middle Chinese initial ny, which we've seen before corresponding to Japanese nya and Korean ing. That's only half of the story, because it actually results in nya in readings from a specific period and to j in readings from another period. Finally, there are 2 characters where z corresponds to nian. This equally unusual equivalence brings us back to the d initial, which also featured nian as a possible option. You see, in standard Japanese, both z and d are pronounced the same way before e, and so what was historically palatal d was respelled as a palatal z in the post-war spelling reforms. This means these characters historically belong to this initial, but this is obfuscated by modern spelling. The next initial is w, although there's only 1 syllable here, wa. It generally corresponds to hiet, but ing and mium are also possible. However, these 17% values, although they look not insignificant, actually represent 1 character each. There are actually only 6 characters with this initial across the analyzed list. And the last initial is r, which is very simple, as it always corresponds to rir. We will see later on, however, that this initial is involved in some interesting phenomena in Korean words. This is a summary of all initials, complete with a list of examples. With codas and initials behind us, we can take a look at finals. Just like in the previous video, I sorted them based on vowels. Let's start with a, which most commonly corresponds to Korean a, plus the expected codas of course. For n and zi, we can also see the secondary rarer equivalents, mium and piep. Another Korean vowel which appears across all these finals is wa. Japanese used to have a medial w as well, but it disappeared, merging with the base vowel. In addition, as we'll see with most finals, other Korean vowels are possible too, although rarer. The unmarked parts of the bars represent various miscellaneous finals whose prevalence I deem too insignificant to include, mostly for better readability, but I will include these separately if you're curious. We can also look at the iotated equivalent of a, that being ya. As you may expect, it usually corresponds to the same vowel in Korean, though in the case of yaku, the predictability drops drastically due to significant vowel variation. One very important thing to note here is that Korean has 3 sibilants, which cannot occur before iotated vowels, and if that were to happen, the vowels would turn into their plain counterparts. This means that anytime you see an iotated vowel, you can assume that if preceded by a sibilant, its quality changes. If a bar features both the iotated and plain version of the vowel, the latter represents instances occurring after non-sibilants. Let's see some examples before we move on to the next vowel. Next up is E, which usually corresponds to its Korean counterpart with the same pronunciation. E is the only vowel which permits both ku and ki as coda, and for the former, the most common equivalent is actually yu. Once again, codas n and ts feature secondary Korean counterparts, mium and piep, and once again there is some additional vowel variation, especially for in. Here's a list of examples. The next vowel we'll analyze is u. I've also included its long version here. For the most part, this vowel is fairly stable, corresponding to u in Korean, except for coda k, which actually surfaces as ok. This Korean vowel can also occur with coda n or with no coda. The long u, however, isn't as predictable, being pretty evenly split between ong and u, though ung is possible as well. Another list of examples. Let's also look at the iotated version, yu. On its own, it usually corresponds to yu, but other options are also found. Yu can occur with codas, yielding fully predictable results in Korean, but it's found exclusively after Japanese sibilants, which means that the Korean equivalents will almost always feature sibilants as well, with very rare exceptions. Finally, the long yu is the least predictable final thus far, most commonly corresponding to yu, then u, ung, up, but several other options are possible as well. Let's look at more examples before moving on. Now we can take a look at e. This vowel usually comes up as Korean ya. This is true for long e as well, though most of the time it includes coda ion. As with previously analyzed vowels, other equivalents are possible too. Finally, when e features no coda, the results are basically unpredictable. Keep in mind though that this final is exceedingly rare in Japanese, and almost always found as a secondary kanji reading, so you're better off basing your guesses of the Korean reading on the more common onyomi. Another list of example characters for your reference. The final Japanese vowel is o. It's also the most unpredictable one. In general, the most common equivalent is o, though for the long Japanese o, the primary Korean equivalent is an. This stems from Japanese readings historically pronounced au, which then mutated to o. Not that this equivalence is very convincing because it only accounts for a quarter of the analyzed characters. O and ong are similarly common, with many other options available as well. This is true for any final including this vowel. It seems that Japanese o can correspond to basically any Korean vowel you can imagine. Its iotated cousin is even less predictable. Yo most commonly corresponds to ya, yoku to ik, and yo to yo, so it looks like there's no clear pattern here. Not to mention, these are only the most common options, none of which break even 50%. Let's see some more examples. We're just left with 3 finals, all of which are diphthongs. I usually surfaces as e in Korean, which makes sense since that vowel used to be pronounced I. Otherwise, e, we, and a few others are also viable options. Ui is a rare final only attested after 4 initials, and it most commonly corresponds to Korean yu, with some other equivalents cropping up as well. Finally, yi is an extremely rare final, never occurring with any initials other than null onset, and always corresponds to yu in Korean. Final list of examples. Let's summarize everything on one screen. Here's a list of all Japanese codas, initials, and finals, along with their major and minor Korean counterparts. And if you're colorblind, rip bozo. Unfortunately, predicting hanja readings based on Sino-Japanese readings is not something that can be done very consistently. However, one advantage of Japanese onyomi is that most kanji have more than one, and sometimes knowing both can narrow down your options quite a bit. As I mentioned earlier in the video, if a kanji has a reading ending in u and another ending in tsu, you can be certain that its Korean equivalent has coda piep. Once you spend enough time with both kanji and hanja, you will likely start noticing some other patterns. For example, a kanji with a reading with initial ny and another with initial j will have initial iing in Korean. Yaku plus eki correspond to yok, e and yo usually correspond to young, etc., etc. Systematically analyzing patterns based on these pairs is beyond the scope of this video, but it might be something I look into at some point in the future. In my previous video, I talked about weird, irregular things kanji do that you need to keep in mind when putting together Sino-Japanese words. As much as I would like to say that Korean is much better about this, I would be lying. While it is true that for the most part you can just take the readings of hanja and string them together to form words, there are still sound changes between the individual characters. It's just that, unlike in Japanese, they're not overtly indicated in spelling, but rather hidden behind it. But let's start with cases where the spelling is, in fact, affected. The first phenomenon is something I already talked about in the first video, and that is tuum 법칙, or the initial sound rule. It consists of the following rules. 1. Word initial riel becomes nian. 2. Word initial iotated diel and nian become ian. One exception is the hanja for 6, which is always spelled yu, but in the middle of a word it's still pronounced as if it was spelled yu. This spelling only applies to numbers because if the hanja is part of any other word, rare though they may be, it's written as yu, as long as it's in the middle of a word. There is one more phenomenon which involves modifying hanja spellings called hwar음조 현상, or euphony. It basically boils down to changing the pronunciation of a word to sound more natural so it rolls off the tongue easier. If we took this word and applied the readings of each constituent hanja, we would get kwasil, but instead the word is spelled kwail. Similarly, for this word we would expect konnan, but instead we get kollan. If you've studied Korean, you might be at least somewhat familiar with this phenomenon because of the names of months, where these irregularities are the most conspicuous, since months are just number plus wol. For June and October, instead of the expected yugwol and sibol, we get yuwol and siwol. And Korean also has a collective name for May and June, which you would expect to be oyugwol, or maybe oyuwol, but in reality it comes out as onyuwol. So these were the cases where the language plays nicely and indicates sound changes in spelling. However, there are also situations in which the spelling betrays you, and you need to adjust your pronunciation accordingly. Thankfully, most of the time it's predictable. And by the way, these rules aren't exclusive to Sino-Korean vocabulary, but all Korean words in general. Let's start with the most basic. If a syllable ends with a consonant and the next starts with a vowel, the consonant moves to the onset of the second syllable. For example, diel is pronounced as l in coda position but d in the onset. So this is pal and but together they're not palum but padum. This is in contrast to Japanese, where a nasal coda preceding a vowel retains its pronunciation, so this is tein, not tenin. In Korean, tomon. One case in which Korean is similar to Japanese, however, is coda ieng, which has no sound at the beginning of a syllable, so if two iengs come in contact, the coda doesn't just disappear, but retains its original pronunciation, as in yongo. Next up, let's talk about initial diel. If it follows another consonant, it usually behaves the same way as nian. This is most noticeable after nasal codas mium and ian. For instance, these words are pronounced umnyo and tongni. After the remaining nasal coda nian, this can also happen. So for example, this is pronounced hyangsinyo. However, this is typically only the case when applying suffixes beginning with a deal. Normally, this combination is pronounced as a geminate l, as in wolle. This is also the case if the consonants are swapped, so nian following a deal, as in sille. Sound changes also occur when a plosive coda is followed by a nasal, in which case the plosive turns into its homorganic nasal equivalent. In Sino-Korean words, this is only relevant for codas piep and kiok, which turn into mium and ian respectively, as in ommu, simnyeon, hyungmyeong, and kungnan. But in native words, this also happens with codas pronounced as t, which turn into nian, like in penmori and nannegi. And remember that initial adiel behaves like nian after consonants, so in sequences piep diel and kiok diel, diel turns into nian, and the plosive turns into a nasal, for instance in pomnyul and kyongni. Same for the t coda, though this pretty much never happens. Now let's talk about aspiration. When a coda plosive is followed by hiet, the two consonants merge into an aspirated plosive. This is something that most people will just do naturally without consciously altering their pronunciation, but I wanted to mention it to cover all bases. Once again, this only happens with codas piep and kiok in Sino-Korean words, as in kupeng and kukwe, but in native words it occurs with a coronal stop as well, for example in motte. If hiet follows a sonorant, it can be overtaken by the preceding consonant, so these words can be pronounced tomo, tonwa, pange, and kyoron, but regular pronunciations tomho, tonhwa, panghe, and kyolhon are also correct. Last and certainly the least is tensing. Korean has this set of tense obstruents which are difficult to pronounce for anyone other than Koreans, and the fact that their existence isn't reflected in the spelling half the time certainly doesn't help. The most regular sound change rule involving these consonants applies when a coda plosive is followed by any consonant that has a tense counterpart. In this case, the latter becomes tense. So for instance, this is not ipjang, but ipjang. Thankfully, these consonants don't contrast with their plain counterparts in Sino-Korean words, so even if you mess up the pronunciation a bit, it's not the end of the world. And if you're listening to the language, you may not even hear the difference. This change is also triggered by coda diel, but only when followed by coronal consonants, as in 활동, 솔직, and 일시, as opposed to kyolbek and ilgi. If you're wondering why this sound change happens, remember that Sino-Korean coda diel originally comes from coda t. The pronunciation later changed to l, and this tensing effect on the following consonant is the only remnant of its former plosive nature. And then there are cases where tensing applies randomly. Typically this happens with certain suffixes, but not always. Korean has this genitive siot, which you can come across in some native words, such as namonip or sepbyol or 젓가락, and this morpheme was sometimes used in Sino-Korean vocabulary as well, except now it's unwritten, usually, but still affects the pronunciation of the following consonant. Wiktionary has this nice table taken from a Korean dictionary that summarizes some of the hanja that commonly undergo tensing, even with percentage scores detailing how likely it is to happen. It's probably best to remember some of the most commonly tense hanja, but even then, you can never be sure. You can even find pairs of homographs with different pronunciations, like sosu and sosu. The last thing I want to do is put my findings to a small test. Let's take 18 two-character Sino-Japanese words and assume we know how to read them. Then, based on my data, let's use the most common Korean equivalent for each initial and final and see where that gets us. Let's not forget that for this word, we need to remove adil from the beginning of the word due to tuumbaptik. And we can even make use of our newly gained knowledge on sound changes to tweak the pronunciation. Okay, now this is what these words actually are in Korean. How do our probability-based guesses compare to reality? well, it's not terrible, but leaves a lot to be desired. We could increase the accuracy with some additional knowledge. For example, for this word, if we know that the first character has two readings, ke and kyo, as I said before, this usually corresponds to young in Korean. Now let's try it the other way around. Let's take the same words, this time starting from their Korean versions, and using the data from the previous video, let's look at their statistically most plausible Japanese equivalents. And this is how these words are actually read in Japanese. How do these two sets compare? Well, it's a little better. We can take a look at both transfers side by side, and you can see that Korean to Japanese has an edge over Japanese to Korean. However, one, it's still not perfect, and two, a sample this small doesn't really tell us much. But that's all that I prepared for this little study. I hope you found it informative, and at least learned something interesting about these two beautiful languages.